The avoidant has spent the entire relationship maintaining careful distance, withdrawing when intimacy deepens, creating space whenever connection threatens their defended position. They have taken the super empath's presence for granted, assuming that no matter how many times they pull away, no matter how consistently they withhold emotional availability, no matter how deeply they retreat into their protective isolation, the empath will remain. The avoidant has built their entire relational strategy on a foundation they never consciously examined. The belief that the empath's capacity for understanding, patience, and unconditional presence has no limit. The avoidant has tested this assumption repeatedly, pushing boundaries to see how much distance they can create before consequences arrive, and each time the empath has absorbed the withdrawal, has made space for the pattern, has continued offering presence despite receiving minimal reciprocation. Then something shifts that the avoidant never anticipated. The empath does not leave with the dramatic exit the avoidant expects and knows how to dismiss. They do not depart with anger the avoidant can use to justify their withdrawal, or with pain the avoidant can minimize as overreaction. The super empath simply becomes unavailable in ways that mirror the avoidant's own patterns, withdrawing their emotional investment with the same quiet finality the avoidant has demonstrated countless times. The empath stops pursuing, stops hoping, stops investing energy in someone who has shown through consistent behavior that they cannot provide what relationship requires. This departure triggers something in the avoidant that their defensive structure has no mechanism to manage. The person who was supposed to wait forever has stopped waiting. The presence they took as permanent has withdrawn. The understanding they exploited has reached its limit. The avoidant begins experiencing destabilization that intensifies as they recognize that the super empath is not temporarily creating space, but has genuinely released them and moved forward. The super empath was never supposed to actually leave. The avoidant's entire relational strategy has operated on implicit assumption that certain people will tolerate infinite amounts of emotional unavailability without reaching a breaking point. The super empath, with their extraordinary capacity for understanding, patience, and compassion, represented exactly this type of person in the avoidant's psychology. The avoidant recognized early in the relationship that the empath possessed qualities that differentiated them from previous partners: deeper emotional maturity, greater capacity to hold space for the avoidant's wounds, more profound understanding of attachment patterns and their origins. The avoidant unconsciously categorized the super empath as someone safe to be unavailable with, someone whose investment was so solid that the avoidant could maintain their defended distance indefinitely. The avoidant's withdrawal patterns throughout the relationship functioned as unconscious testing of the empath's limits. Each time the avoidant created distance, each period of reduced communication, each instance of emotional unavailability served dual purpose: managing the avoidant's own discomfort with intimacy, while simultaneously confirming that the empath would remain despite the avoidant's limitations. The empath's consistent return after each withdrawal, their continued patience despite repeated disappointment, their maintained hope, despite accumulated evidence that the avoidant could not provide reciprocal presence. All of this confirmed the avoidant's belief that this person would never actually leave. This belief allowed the avoidant to maintain their defended position without facing consequences that might motivate change. The avoidant could withdraw whenever intimacy triggered their defenses, secure in the knowledge that the empath would still be there when the avoidant briefly returned. They could prioritize their need for distance over the relationship's health, because the relationship's continuation never felt genuinely threatened. The empath's extraordinary capacity became the avoidant's psychological safety net, the guarantee that allowed them to remain defended without losing connection entirely. The avoidant also interpreted the empath's patience as confirmation that their own limitations were acceptable, that their emotional unavailability was not actually problematic, if the empath, with all their emotional intelligence and self-awareness, continued choosing to stay despite the avoidant's patterns, then perhaps those patterns were not as damaging as others had claimed. The avoidant used the empath's continued presence as evidence that their defensive structure was reasonable, that others who had left simply lacked the empath's capacity for understanding and acceptance. The avoidant never considered that the empath's staying reflected the empath's own wounds and excessive tolerance rather than validation of the avoidant's behavior. When the super empath actually leaves, this entire psychological structure collapses. The person who was never supposed to reach their limit has reached it. The presence that felt permanent has withdrawn. The understanding that seemed infinite has ended. The avoidant experiences profound disorientation because the foundational assumption organizing their relational approach has been proven false. They discover that even someone with extraordinary capacity for patience and understanding will eventually stop accepting emotional unavailability, that even the most compassionate person will ultimately choose themselves over continued accommodation of someone else's defended limitations. This recognition triggers panic in the avoidant that exceeds what they experienced when less patient partners left. Previous departures, while uncomfortable, confirmed the avoidant's narrative that others wanted too much, that relationships inevitably become suffocating, that their withdrawal was justified response to unreasonable demands. The super empath's departure cannot be fit into this narrative. The empath asked for nothing excessive, demanded nothing unreasonable, wanted only the basic emotional presence that healthy relationship requires. Their leaving forces the avoidant to confront that their defensive patterns, not others' excessive expectations, create their relational failures. The avoidant begins experiencing frantic energy that their defensive structure has no mechanism to manage. They feel compelled to reach out despite their typical comfort with distance, to pursue despite their usual withdrawn position, to attempt connection despite their defended preference for space. This impulse contradicts everything in the avoidant's relational approach. The avoidant has organized their psychology around being the person who withdraws, who needs space, who maintains distance. Suddenly, finding themselves in the position of pursuer creates cognitive dissonance that destabilizes their entire self-concept. The avoidant's panic intensifies as they recognize that their usual strategies for managing relationship endings do not work with the super empath's departure. Typically, the avoidant handles breakups by minimizing the relationship's importance, by focusing on the relief of escaped pressure, by quickly redirecting attention toward other pursuits or people. These strategies fail with the super empath because the avoidant knows, at some level they cannot fully suppress, that this relationship was different. The empath saw them clearly, understood their wounds, and still chose to invest in connection with them. The avoidant cannot minimize someone who knew them so thoroughly. They cannot pretend relief when they feel grief they have no practice managing. The avoidant also cannot quickly replace what the super empath provided because what the empath offered was not the surface level connection the avoidant typically settles for. The empath provided genuine understanding, consistent patience, and authentic care that penetrated the avoidant's defenses in ways that felt both terrifying and profoundly nourishing. The avoidant has never encountered this combination of qualities in another person and unconsciously understands they are unlikely to find it again. This recognition creates desperation that overwhelms the avoidant's typical defended detachment. The avoidant begins acting in ways that contradict their entire established pattern. They initiate contact they would normally avoid. They express vulnerability they typically suppress. They pursue connection they usually withdraw from. These behaviors emerge not from genuine transformation, but from panic at losing what they never valued adequately while they had it. The avoidant experiences what others have felt throughout the relationship: the desperate desire to maintain connection with someone who seems to be slipping away, and discovers that this position is far more uncomfortable than their familiar defended distance, the sudden absence of unconditional emotional labor. The super empath has provided invisible infrastructure that maintained the avoidant's comfortable defended position throughout the relationship. This infrastructure consisted of countless acts of emotional labor the avoidant never consciously recognized. The empath bridging distance the avoidant created, the empath maintaining hope when the avoidant offered nothing to sustain it, the empath interpreting the avoidant's withdrawal charitably rather than as rejection, the empath managing their own disappointment without burdening the avoidant, the empath creating connection despite the avoidant's consistent unavailability. This labor operated silently, requiring tremendous energy from the empath while appearing effortless to the avoidant who benefited from it. The avoidant took this emotional labor as natural backdrop to the relationship rather than recognizing it as active effort the empath chose to provide. The avoidant assumed that relationships simply function this way, that connection maintains itself without requiring both people's investment, that someone else will always do the work of keeping intimacy alive when the avoidant cannot or will not. The avoidant has never had to consider how much effort the empath expended to compensate for the avoidant's emotional unavailability, because that effort remained largely invisible, woven into the relationship's fabric in ways the avoidant never examined. When the super empath walks away, they take with them all the emotional labor that has been sustaining the relationship despite the avoidant's limitations. Suddenly, no one is bridging the distance the avoidant creates. No one is maintaining hope on the avoidant's behalf. No one is interpreting the avoidant's behavior generously. No one is managing disappointment silently. No one is compensating for the avoidant's withdrawal, the entire invisible structure that allowed the relationship to continue despite profound imbalance disappears in the empath's absence. The avoidant experiences this absence as sudden destabilization they cannot understand. They do not consciously recognize that the empath was providing all this labor because they never consciously observed it occurring. The avoidant simply feels that something fundamental has shifted, that the relationship that seemed to function adequately despite their distance has completely collapsed. The avoidant cannot identify what has changed because what has changed is not any specific action, but rather the cessation of countless small actions the empath was taking to maintain connection. The avoidant was not reciprocating. This destabilization forces the avoidant into a position they have never occupied. They must either provide the emotional labor themselves or accept the relationship's complete dissolution. The avoidant discovers that relationships do not maintain themselves, that connection requires active tending from both people, that their withdrawal only worked because someone else was doing double the effort to compensate. This recognition overwhelms the avoidant because they lack practice at the very emotional labor the empath was providing. The avoidant does not know how to bridge distance, maintain hope, interpret generously, or manage disappointment because they have never had to develop these capacities. The avoidant attempts to reach out but discovers their efforts feel clumsy and inadequate compared to what the empath provided effortlessly. The avoidant's attempts at connection lack the warmth, consistency, and genuine emotional availability that characterized the empath's investment. The avoidant can perform gestures of reaching out, but cannot replicate the authentic care that motivated the empath's labor. This inadequacy becomes painfully apparent when the avoidant's efforts meet the empath's boundaried response or complete silence, highlighting the vast difference between the avoidant's minimal, awkward attempts and the empath's sustained, skillful emotional labor. The avoidant also faces the emotional cost of providing labor they previously avoided. Maintaining hope requires tolerating uncertainty and disappointment. Bridging distance requires risking rejection. Interpreting generously requires managing one's own hurt without defensive retaliation. Managing disappointment silently requires emotional regulation capacity the avoidant has never developed. The avoidant discovers that the emotional labor they took for granted actually demands significant psychological resources and skill. The work is exhausting precisely because it involves capacities the avoidant's defensive structure has prevented them from developing. The absence of the empath's labor also eliminates buffering that protected the avoidant from fully experiencing their own pattern's consequences. When the empath was present, their continued investment, despite the avoidant's withdrawal, meant the avoidant never faced the full weight of their emotional unavailability. The empath absorbed the relationship's costs, processed the disappointment, managed the distance, and maintained the connection. The avoidant could remain defended without experiencing the loneliness that their defense should naturally create, because the empath's presence prevented that loneliness from fully registering. With the empath gone, the avoidant sits with unmediated consequences of their defensive patterns. They experience the actual isolation that their withdrawal creates when no one is working to prevent that isolation from becoming complete. They feel the genuine loneliness that emotional unavailability produces when no one is compensating with sustained effort to maintain connection. They face the authentic emptiness that their defended position generates when no one else is filling that emptiness through their own emotional investment. This direct experience of their pattern's natural consequences creates discomfort the avoidant has successfully avoided throughout the relationship. The avoidant begins recognizing retroactively how much the empath was doing to maintain what the avoidant took as baseline relationship functioning. They remember moments where the empath reached out after the avoidant's withdrawal and realized those moments represented active choice the empath was making rather than automatic relationship maintenance. They recall times the empath maintained warm presence despite the avoidant's coldness, and understand that warmth required deliberate effort rather than emerging naturally. They recognize that the connection they assumed simply existed was actually being actively created by the empath's consistent emotional labor while they provided virtually nothing in return. This recognition creates guilt and shame the avoidant has difficulty managing because their defensive structure includes limited capacity for sitting with these emotions. The avoidant wants to blame the empath for leaving, wants to minimize the labor the empath was providing, wants to return to their comfortable defended position where they do not have to acknowledge their profound failures of reciprocity. Yet the super empath's departure makes these defensive maneuvers impossible. The contrast between what the empath gave and what the avoidant offered cannot be denied. The avoidant must face that they have been in relationship with someone who loved them generously while they return that love with consistent emotional unavailability and lack of effort, the mirror they can no longer avoid. Throughout the relationship, the super empath's presence has provided the avoidant with constant distraction from examining their own patterns. The avoidant could focus on managing the empath's needs, on maintaining just enough distance to feel safe, on navigating the empath's emotional responses to their withdrawal. This external focus allowed the avoidant to avoid internal examination of why they withdraw, what they fear in intimacy, and what their defensive patterns cost them. The empath's presence, paradoxically, gave the avoidant something to react to rather than something to reflect upon. The avoidant could organize their psychology around responding to the empath rather than examining themselves. The avoidant also used the empath's continued presence as evidence that their patterns were not actually problematic. As long as the empath stayed, as long as someone of the empath's emotional intelligence and capacity chose to remain in relationship with them, the avoidant could tell themselves their defensive withdrawal was acceptable. The empath's staying functioned as implicit validation that the avoidant's limitations were not severe enough to warrant change. The avoidant could point to the relationship's continuation as proof that they were capable of partnership, that their emotional unavailability was not a fundamental issue requiring examination or transformation. When the super empath walks away, they remove both the distraction and the validation that prevented the avoidant from confronting their patterns. The avoidant suddenly has no one to manage, no one's needs to deflect from, no one's responses to navigate. The external focus that occupied the avoidant's attention disappears, leaving the avoidant alone with their own internal landscape. This forced inward attention creates profound discomfort because the avoidant has spent their life organizing their psychology around external focus that prevents internal examination. The avoidant does not know how to sit with themselves without distraction, without someone else to orient toward, without relationship dynamics to occupy their mental energy. The empath's departure also eliminates the validation that the avoidant unconsciously relied upon. The fact that even someone as patient and understanding as the super empath eventually left communicates undeniable message. The avoidance patterns are severe enough that even extraordinary capacity for tolerance reaches its limit. The avoidant can no longer tell themselves their defensive withdrawal is acceptable because someone who saw them clearly, understood their wounds deeply, and still chose to leave, has demonstrated through that choice that the avoidance limitations are not sustainable in intimate relationship. The empath's absence functions as mirror reflecting that the avoidance defensive structure creates relationships that eventually fail, regardless of how patient or understanding the other person is. This mirror forces the avoidant to examine patterns they have successfully avoided confronting throughout their life. The avoidant must face that they consistently withdraw when intimacy deepens, that they cannot sustain emotional presence, that they retreat into defended isolation whenever vulnerability threatens their protective structure. These patterns, which the avoidant has minimized or justified throughout the relationship, become undeniable in the stark clarity of the empath's absence. The avoidant cannot blame the empath for leaving when the empath demonstrated such extraordinary patience. They cannot claim they would be more available with different partner when they had partner who created optimal conditions and still could not maintain presence. The avoidant also confronts the cost of their defensive patterns in ways they could avoid while the empath remained. The avoidant sees clearly that their withdrawal destroyed relationship with someone who offered genuine love, authentic understanding, and consistent presence. They recognize that their inability to reciprocate emotionally has cost them connection that enriched their life in ways they could not appreciate while defended against fully receiving it. They understand that their patterns do not protect them from pain, but rather guarantee different pain. The loss of people who genuinely care for them, the isolation that comes from pushing away anyone who gets close, the regret of recognizing too late what they destroyed through their defended unavailability. The mirror the empath's absence provides reflects not just the avoidance patterns, but also the person the avoidant has become through decades of defensive living. The avoidant sees someone who has organized their entire existence around avoiding vulnerability, who has sacrificed intimacy for the illusion of safety, who has chosen defended isolation over the risk of genuine connection. This reflection is devastating because it contradicts the avoidant's self-concept. The avoidant has told themselves they are independent, self-sufficient, content with their autonomous life. The mirror reveals someone who is defended, isolated, and fundamentally alone, not by authentic choice, but by compulsive fear. The avoidant experiences this forced self-examination as intensely uncomfortable because their defensive structure has no mechanism for processing what the mirror reveals. The avoidant's psychology has organized around avoiding exactly this kind of internal confrontation. When forced to face their patterns without distraction, when stripped of the validation that someone's continued presence provided, when unable to focus externally rather than internally, the avoidant encounters psychological territory they are completely unprepared to navigate. The discomfort drives them toward any action that might restore the old dynamic, that might bring back the distraction and validation, that might allow them to stop seeing what the mirror reveals. The avoidant's attempts to restore contact with the empath often stem from this desperate need to eliminate the mirror rather than from genuine transformation. The avoidant reaches out not because they have changed, but because they cannot tolerate what they see when forced to look at themselves without the empath's presence providing distraction and implicit validation. The avoidant wants the empath to return so they can stop confronting their patterns, so they can return to the comfortable defended position where someone else's presence allowed them to avoid internal examination. This motivation, while understandable, reveals that the avoidant has not yet done the genuine work that the mirror is inviting. The super empath's sustained absence keeps the mirror in place, preventing the avoidant from escaping the self-examination that genuine growth requires. As long as the empath remains unavailable, as long as they maintain their boundaries and refuse to return to the old dynamic, the avoidant cannot avoid confronting what the mirror reveals. The avoidant faces choice: either continue defending against what they see, maintaining their patterns while accepting the loneliness those patterns guarantee, or finally examine honestly what the mirror shows and begin the difficult work of transformation. The mirror does not judge, does not condemn, does not demand. It simply reflects what is, forcing the avoidant to decide whether they will continue avoiding their reflection or finally face what they have been running from their entire life: the irreplaceability they never acknowledged. The avoidant has moved through relationships with underlying assumption that people are essentially interchangeable, that if one person leaves, another will eventually appear to fill the same role, that the particular individual matters less than the function they serve in the avoidant's defended life. This belief has protected the avoidant from fully valuing any specific person, because attachment to irreplaceable individuals creates vulnerability the avoidant cannot tolerate. The avoidant has convinced themselves that their partner's unique qualities are not actually unique, that what one person provides another could provide equally well, that relationships are essentially fungible arrangements rather than connections between specific individuals whose particular characteristics create irreproducible dynamics. The super empath's specific qualities have created relational experience fundamentally different from what the avoidant has encountered with others, yet the avoidant has not consciously acknowledged this difference. The empath's combination of deep emotional intelligence, extraordinary patience, genuine understanding of attachment wounds, and capacity to hold space for the avoidance patterns without losing themselves represented rare confluence of characteristics. The empath could see the avoidant clearly, including their defenses and limitations, while maintaining compassionate perspective that recognized those defenses as adaptive strategies rather than character flaws. This level of sophisticated understanding is exceedingly uncommon. The empath also possessed secure enough attachment to avoid becoming anxiously enmeshed with the avoidance patterns, while having enough capacity for patience to remain present through the avoidance withdrawal cycles. This balance, secure enough to maintain self, while patient enough to allow space for the avoidance defensive needs, represents narrow band of attachment capacity. Most people either lack the security to avoid becoming destabilized by the avoidance withdrawal, or lack the patience to tolerate the avoidance patterns long enough for trust to potentially develop. The super empath occupied this rare middle ground where they could be both boundaried and generous, both self-possessed and accommodating. When the super empath walks away, the avoidant begins attempting to replicate what they lost, only to discover that the empath's qualities cannot be found easily or perhaps at all in new partners. The avoidant encounters people who have some of the empath's characteristics but lack others. They meet patient people who lack emotional depth. They find understanding people who lack boundaries and become anxiously attached. They discover emotionally intelligent people who lack patience for the avoidance patterns. Each new connection highlights through contrast what the super empath uniquely provided: the complete package of qualities that created space where the avoidant could be defended without facing immediate consequences. The avoidant's attempts to replace the super empath with someone similar reveal the avoidant's continued misunderstanding of what created their destabilization. The avoidant believes they need to find another person with the empath's patience and understanding so they can return to comfortable, defended position. The avoidant does not recognize that the super empath's departure itself signals that no one, regardless of their capacity, will indefinitely accommodate emotional unavailability. The avoidant seeks another person who will allow them to remain defended, rather than recognizing that the problem is not finding the right person to accommodate their limitations, but rather addressing the limitations themselves. This recognition forces the avoidant to face that they cannot simply replace the super empath and return to comfortable defended position. They have lost something that took years to build, that depended on the empath's rare qualities and their specific knowledge of the avoidant, that cannot be quickly found or easily recreated. The avoidant must either accept this loss and live with the grief of recognizing too late what they had, or use the recognition of the super empath's irreplaceability as catalyst to finally examine why they could not value and reciprocate adequately while they had the chance. The irreplaceability that the avoidant never acknowledged while the empath was present becomes painfully obvious in their absence, forcing the avoidant to confront that their defensive patterns cost them something precious they may never find again.